This third course, Procurement Strategies, is divided into 5 sections. Sustainable versus responsible procurement, sustainable procurement approach, additional benefits, sustainability impact KPIs, and the course conclusions. In the previous course, we covered the more operational supply chain management processes like manufacturing, logistics, warehousing, and product management. In this course, we're going to go deep into sourcing and procurement. We present a slightly different approach due to the nature of procurement areas and organizations. These are the course objectives. Welcome to Section 1, Sustainable versus Responsible Procurement. Sustainable procurement practices include environmental and social factors in sourcing strategies and decisions. Now, this is a very standard concept. However, I find this other concept of responsible procurement very meaningful. Responsible procurement implies that procurement professionals take it as their personal rather than their company's responsibility to secure that these principles are implemented. The authors of this concept state that responsible purchasing does not only look at the effects of supplier relationships on company financial results, risks, and reputation. Rather, it also includes designing and implementing supply chain solutions that are beneficial not only for the company, but also for the world around us. So, what is the impact of procurement areas on sustainability? At the beginning of the first course, Supply Chain Fundamentals, we talked about the 10 UN Sustainable Development Goals and how supply chains can impact many of these goals. Now, apart from these goals, they developed 10 UN Global Compact principles that have a direct relationship with supply chain sustainability, and especially with procurement practices. Companies should put into practice these principles and ensure that their suppliers apply them as well. Human rights abuses, forced and compulsory labor, child labor, unfriendly environmental practices, procurement fraud, corruption, extortion, and bribery are among the most common issues that companies have to deal with when they look beyond their tier 1 suppliers, especially in undeveloped and/or low-cost countries. Welcome to Section 2, Sustainable Procurement Approach. I want to start by saying that every company has a different approach when it comes to sustainability. There's no standard for it. The approach I'm going to present is like a guideline companies can use for their sustainable supply chain journey, especially for procurement. Now, this approach has 9 steps, and before going into the details of each one of these steps, I want to present some different levels of the steps. Now, the first 3, company assessment, vision and expectations, and supplier prioritization, form the base. These steps are done once, and you can review them occasionally, but they're not everyday steps, especially the first 2. They set foundations of the company in this journey. From steps 4 to 6, we have recurrent steps. These are everyday actions companies can take with their suppliers. They measure performance, they have a monitor system in place, they remediate the issues, and include sustainability criteria in the procurement process. And the last 3 steps, training and capability building, supplier collaboration, and stakeholder partnerships, are more advanced steps companies can make when they have a more mature sustainable procurement area and company. Now, these 2 are based on innovation and expansion. Having said that, let's look at each one of them in detail. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.1, Company Assessment. One of the first steps that you need to follow to develop a supply chain sustainability program is to perform an assessment of the company to understand the internal and external landscape. Now, this is not oriented just toward procurement, but toward the supply chain in general. A multidisciplinary group should be involved in this. The task here will help identify the highest priority supply chain issues for the company, evaluate risks and opportunities, and build the internal support to move forward. Now, how do you do this? You can start by gathering some data and asking some questions, like, what are your key products and services? How do you transport materials? Where do you operate? How many suppliers do you have? Where are they located? How much money do you spend on them? Do you source directly or through third parties? And so on. Now remember, the idea is to identify risks and opportunities. To map your supply chain beyond your first tier is a very difficult task. I'm not going to lie. However, it's possible to conduct this mapping through shared data systems, category manager buyer knowledge, and by asking suppliers. Now, the goal is to identify the areas where sustainability challenges are most likely to occur. They can be sourced from regions that are commonly recognized for sustainability issues, like conflict mineral regions, or suppliers whose nature of the business activity is usually associated with a set of common sustainability risks. For each area identified, companies should trace the flow of materials and information. The whole supply chain could be considered for this exercise, going back to raw materials and original suppliers. Now, why is this important? Let's look at this example. This is a case study from a very known children's toy company. They became the front page news due to their problem with Chinese suppliers. A few suppliers had replaced certified paint with cheaper paints to reduce costs, but unfortunately, the new paint contained lead, which is considered to be very harmful. They had to recall almost 2 million toys. Mattel realized that it was not monitoring its contact manufacturers closely enough. Continuing with the assessment, companies should identify and understand the expectations of their stakeholders. These can be employees, customers, suppliers, communities, investors, governments, peers, and NGOs. Stakeholders are often the first to identify emerging environmental, social, governance, and economic impacts in the supply chain. We recommend engaging early and regularly with stakeholders, taking a proactive approach to these issues, and to partner with them rather than discovering the issues publicly later. Then ideally, you should also look at your peers to see what they're doing in terms of sustainability supply chains, to get some ideas, to create some partnerships even. We can talk about this later in the course because there are more advanced steps that companies can usually take. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.2, Vision and Expectations. Having a clear vision and objectives for a company's sustainable supply chain program will provide direction for its strategy and help to define its company's commitment. In the process of developing the vision, it's important to include, or at least consult, executives and senior managers from all parts of the business related to the supply chain. This is done to get buy-in and support from them. Here are some considerations for the vision and the objectives. Generally, they involve some of these topics: strategic, operational, reputation, or compliance business goals. The output of the process should be a statement of vision and commitment that is anchored in the company's values and ethics. This is an example from Walmart. Their focus is on climate, nature, waste, working conditions, responsible procurement, and economic opportunity for people working in their supply chains. There are also their goals. They have goals for climate, waste, nature, and people. These are some of them. Although goals are usually designed at a high level for the entire business, these objectives need to be translated into actionable targets for managers across all functions in an integrated and coherent manner. For example, A goal on the number of suppliers that attend sustainability training can be translated into a target for individual supply chain management professionals within each sourcing group that manages supplier relationships. Having a vision statement and goals is not enough if it's not translated into more concrete guidelines for suppliers and supply chain professionals in your company. The most common way of doing this is through a supplier code of conduct and a sustainable procurement policy. When developing supplier codes of conduct, there are some topics that you should consider, like the UN Global Compact principles and several international standards that should also be consulted. And here's a list of topics and references that you can use. The code and the procurement policy, which is used to establish sustainability expectations internally, should be completely aligned. Supply chain professionals should become familiar with it in order to communicate it to existing and new suppliers. Companies often take a variety of approaches to communicate codes to suppliers, such as one-time communication, inclusion of the code at first points of contact with suppliers, integration of the code into supplier contracts, review of the code at regular business meetings, and also annual supplier acknowledgement of supplier code of conduct. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.3, Supplier Prioritization. To assess and engage with all your suppliers can be an impossible task. Companies should identify which suppliers to engage with first and to what extent. But how can they do that? Well, first they need to conduct a spend analysis. Now, ideally, companies should have their spend managed into categories. A spend category is the logical grouping of similar expenditure items or services that have been clearly identified on an organizational level. For example, office supplies may be considered a spend category. You should prioritize the categories first and set the general strategies for each. Then engage the suppliers within those categories. So it's more like a category prioritization that ends up with a supplier prioritization. So if you don't have spend categories identified, use any kind of grouping or by contracts. Now, this is a sustainability sourcing matrix. It's a variation of the Kralitch matrix used to segment the purchases or suppliers of a company. It's divided into 4 quadrants, showing the business impact on one axis and the sustainability risk on the other side. Business impact considers expenditure levels, leverage, key products and services, impact on the organization, business continuity, and sustainability considers environmental, social, and economic risks. The spend categories can be classified into critical, non-critical, business-driven, and sustainability-driven. This is an example of how the matrix looks like when you place spend categories on it. For simplicity, we place services and products, but ideally you would have a circle for each spend category managed. For instance, office supplies, transportation services, legal services, hardware and software, among others. The goal here is to identify and prioritize the categories and the suppliers that present the greatest risks for the company and to address them accordingly. Now, let's talk a little bit about how you can develop this matrix. First, you need to identify what criteria to use for business impact. The most used is the annual spend. Some companies even use this as the only criterion for business impact. However, best practices suggest that other elements should be taken into consideration, like the impact of having this product or service for the business continuity and others listed here. I'm going to explain this with an example. Imagine you run a construction company, and we have to analyze 3 categories of spend: concrete, construction steel, and renting a specific excavation equipment. This last one is a service. To place them in the matrix, you need to define business impact criteria and their weights. Now, there are 3 criteria that we can use. Depending on the weight you give them, you can have low spend items with an overall high business impact. For instance, I'm sure you can agree that in any construction company, concrete and steel are very strategic supplies, and they must represent a high percentage of total annual spend. So you place them here at the top of the matrix, top left. Then you probably don't spend that much money renting very specific excavation equipment compared to concrete and steel. However, it's critical for the business continuity to have them, so you can't operate without this equipment. So depending on the weight of this criteria, you might place this category on the top or on the center of the matrix. Remember that in this example, we're just analyzing the business impact with no consideration of the sustainability risks. Hence, we're only moving on the vertical direction of the graphic. But the general idea here is that there are more considerations apart from annual spend that you can use in the business impact axis. Next, you need to define what criteria to use for sustainability risk. Now, it's important to know that it is impossible to do the risk analysis for all possible sustainability issues. A common mistake is to try and solve all the world's problems, spending time debating sustainability risk issues that cannot be yet resolved. So, you should identify sustainability issues that could be addressed by a more sustainable procurement approach. Now, what does that mean? That can be influenced through procurement by placing an increased focus on energy efficiency, logistics, or the manufacturer's production processes. For instance, climate change, natural resource use optimization, waste minimization, job creation, fair play, among other things that you may see on this list. The list needs to be balanced, addressing social, environmental, and economic issues. Then you have to develop a short list. How can you do that? Well, you can create a ranking system to evaluate how important is this issue for the company. You can see how these issues relate to the vision and target of the company has set regarding sustainability, like be carbon neutral in 10 more years. What scope is there to improve? Here you need to think about how well the issue is currently addressed in your company. If it's already well managed, then there may be a little scope to deliver any improvement. Will the market be able to respond to this issue? You need to consider if suppliers will be able to support this initiative and if the industry could deliver improvement in this issue. Now, this is very important because the idea is to focus on key issues, deploying procurement resources as efficiently as possible. If an issue is not important or improving the situation is almost impossible, then there is little point in spending time dealing with that issue. You should end up with a short list like this example, where the first 5 issues were prioritized using these criteria. Once you have determined the proposed short list of key sustainability issues, you should consult with the stakeholders to check that the issues you have identified are appropriate for the stakeholders' needs. Then you need to determine key questions that could be applied to any purchase to form the basis of an initial risk assessment. Let's look at some examples. If the issue is the use of natural resources, the question can be, is the product made or does the service provide and use unsustainable material? Is the issue fair play? Fair pay, not fair play. Are suppliers operating in developing countries that have difficulty enforcing minimum wage? And so on. After defining both business and sustainability criteria for assessing these categories, you can develop the sustainability sourcing matrix to identify which critical categories and suppliers you should address first. The analysis and segmentation of spend categories using a sustainability matrix does not only guide you to identify the priority that should be given to a particular spend area, but it also suggests general procurement strategies. For instance, for non-critical categories, you should not pay a price premium for sustainability. Makes sense because you have a low sustainability risk. For business-driven categories, you should focus mostly on cost reduction, but also drive sustainability as far as possible. For sustainability driven, you should include sustainability criteria in the procurement process and change suppliers to the most sustainable ones. Because it's a low business impact category, you should really focus on sustainability and not so much on costs and impacts of the business. Now, for the critical categories, you should focus on both. Also, develop a close supplier relationship and drive for innovation and continuous improvement to reduce cost and sustainability risks. Now, as you can see, the strategies will vary depending on the quadrant the spend is located in. When to apply this strategy depending on the stage of procurement process and the way you approach suppliers is explained in the following chapters. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.4, Performance Assessment. Once companies have identified the scope of their program and priority areas for action, the next step requires engaging with suppliers to address the most severe sustainability issues in the supply chain. But before performing a supplier assessment, it's recommended to identify potential areas for supplier evaluation and also the degree of influence the company has over the supplier. Let's explain the first one. You already identified general sustainable risk of the category by using the sustainability sourcing matrix. Now you have to dig a little bit deeper into the suppliers and contracts of the categories you prioritized. Here are some examples of supplier risks. For instance, high CO2 emissions, subcontracts with poor sustainability credentials, lack of training, unsustainable materials, and others. Now, why is it recommended that you do this? Because you can have two suppliers of the same product, but let's say one of them is located in the United States, where you know there are regulations regarding child labor, for instance. But the other is located in a developing country where regulations might not be so strict on this subject. Hence, just the risks are different. This means you need to focus on the assessment of suppliers according to the main risks. We'll go back to this point later when addressing audits and self-assessments. I listed here some tools and resources you can use to identify geographic and commodity-specific risks. Second, it's important to consider the degree of influence you have with your suppliers before beginning any assessment and development activity. To do this, you must look at your company from the market perspective. It's likely that where you are an attractive customer, you will be more able to specify and achieve more sustainable outcomes. For instance, you can analyze if your company's spend on the supplier represents a significant amount of the supplier's revenue, or if you have high switching costs from this supplier to another. You should now have a list of suppliers, target based on those risks, and an estimate of the degree of influence. To assess the sustainability performance of suppliers, there are several methods you can use. Self-assessment audits, contract terms, worker surveys, among other things. Now, they are part of monitoring systems that companies put in place to provide information on how well suppliers are performing on sustainability practices. Now, here are some pros and cons of using these tools. It's important to say that companies usually use all of them or a combination of them. They never really rely on just one assessment tool. Now, this is a case study of HP, the large information technology company. They request medium or high-risk suppliers to complete a self-assessment. Then, if required, the suppliers create and implement an improvement plan. It has been shown that these self-assessments help suppliers become more aware of HP expectations. Now, additionally, the company uses 3 other monitoring tools: annual audits against their code of conduct, targeted assessment for specific risk areas, for instance, vulnerable workers or fire safety. And at last, they have a KPI program where suppliers provide data on working hours, student workers, core labor rights, and others. Now, here are some suggested areas to review in a sustainability performance assessment. These can be included in an audit, self-assessment, or another type of monitoring system. They're the same UN principles we covered earlier at the beginning of the course. Now, the approach here is to discuss each issue with the supplier and seek evidence of these practices or subjects. The idea is to promote transparency and traceability. Now, for instance, regarding the environment, you can review certifications, site management issues, training and awareness, sustainable procurement practices, processes, and others. And regarding social and economic, you can review social ethical responsibilities, human rights and labor, occupational health and safety, community engagement, and others. Now, all of these subjects are based on the same policy areas we talked about earlier when establishing expectations through the Code of Conduct. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.5, Issue Remediation. Issue remediation means working with suppliers to address issues of poor performance or non-compliance. But what does issue remediation include? Having completed an assessment, the areas of concern should be discussed with the supplier, suggesting possible actions, and there should be an agreement on the findings and actions with them. Now, these actions need to be realistic, and they also need to be time-bound so that progress can be monitored, because if not, the company can lose credibility. It's important that remediation requirements are communicated very clearly to suppliers, and that there are established timelines and consequences for not meeting them and/or continuing performance. Now, a company may ultimately need to terminate the supplier relationship. But if the supplier is critical to the business operations and they decide to keep the relationship, the company has to accept the potential reputational, financial, and legal consequences of this action. Many companies starting out in supply chain sustainability are focused on addressing situations when supplier performance on sustainability issues is poor. However, often suppliers are more motivated by incentives for strong performance than by negative consequences. Now, some incentives companies can use are reducing the number of audits conducted, establishing a preferred supplier program, increasing business, providing recognitions and awards, allowing participation in strategic buyer-supplier planning meetings, sharing costs for sustainability improvements, providing assistance for capability building. Now, another incentive that is not listed here is a financial incentive. Let's look at this case study from Levi's. Levi's offers reduced loan financing to those suppliers with the strongest sustainability performance. They also provide short-term finance to emerging market suppliers and small and mid-size exporters. Normally, companies implement incentives as their supply chain sustainability program evolves. It's also common to grant rewards for consistently strong performance. Another example is from Coca-Cola. The largest European bottler, Coca-Cola, is set to link a new finance program to its sustainability target to incentivize suppliers to improve approaches to sustainability and build towards a net zero target set for 2040. The company is aiming to help all of its strategic suppliers set science-based targets and transition to 100% renewable electricity by 2023. For ingredient and packaging related emissions, the company will accelerate plans relating to sustainable agriculture and 100% recycled plastics. Some life cycle analyses have found that soft drink bottles made using 100% post-consumer recycled plastic generate 40% less CO2e than virgin plastic bottles. The company originally earmarked 250 million euros to be spent over a 3-year period back in 2020 to develop its immediate action plan for meeting its new climate goals. Money will be used to support suppliers, improve efficiency, and accelerate R&D around packaging materials. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.6, Procurement Process. Part 1. Audits and remediation are for current suppliers and contracts already in place. But what about future suppliers or future acquisitions? Well, when a contract is first being planned, risks should be identified and documented. Now, if you recall in previous slides, we set some examples of supplier risks. Let's use the same example. You need to acquire a product or a service and identify these risks. Potentially high CO2 emissions, poor training, unsustainable materials, and others. Then you need to identify how these risks can be managed. Right? Now, generally, each contract will typically employ a range of these management options. Option 1, risk cannot be managed. Option 2, the risk can be managed by the choice of supplier. Option 3, the risk can be managed by the specification. These risks need to be turned into criteria that suppliers can bid against. Option 4, the supplier needs to provide proposals on their approach. Option 5, the risk can be managed by targets in the contract. It's important to know that each risk must be analyzed independently and identify the best option to manage that specific risk. This means that, for instance, the high CO2 emissions can be managed by contract management, and the risk related to unsustainable material can be addressed in the specification. Now, the options listed here are completely related to the procurement processes we're going to address, which are supplier selection, specification, bid evaluation, contract management. When determining which stage of the procurement process is best to manage a particular sustainability issue, it's worth considering which stage of the product or service lifecycle issue relates to. For example, issues that relate to raw materials are better managed by specifications, manufacturer service delivery is better managed by supplier selection. In the stage of the life cycle, it's recommended to focus on specification. And in the disposal, you should ideally focus on the supplier responsibility for the disposal. Now, this is not an exact science, but the message here is to think about the specific sustainability risk and where you believe it's best to manage it. As we mentioned before, there are 4 stages of the procurement process where you can apply different sustainability criteria and strategies. We will address them in the next videos. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.6, Procurement Process, Part 2. There are 4 stages of the procurement process where you can apply different sustainability criteria: supplier selection, specification, bid evaluation, and contract management. Now, let's see an example of possible options to manage the sustainability issue of energy efficiency and CO2 reduction in each of these stages. Now, first, in the supplier selection stage, only allow suppliers who have an environmental management system with CO2 reduction targets to bid. But how do you know which suppliers to invite into a bidding process? Well, if it's a public process, you can specify that it is mandatory to comply with this in order to apply. But you can also launch a request for information and ask suppliers to provide details of their environmental management systems. Then you can select the right suppliers to bid. 2. Specify that you will only buy energy efficient rated equipment such as Energy Star. A specification is a description of the product or service required, reflecting your sustainability demands. It is also recommended that it be set to minimum standards in the specification when determining sustainability criteria. You can also detail additional or preferred sustainability criteria, but keep in mind that all suppliers must comply with a minimum in order to pass the technical evaluation. Third, in the bid evaluation process, ask the suppliers to propose the most energy efficient or lowest CO2 impact products. The bid evaluation is usually always made based on the best value for money. However, other non-financial factors can be used to evaluate and select the best supplier. The bid evaluation process must provide a fair, transparent, and accountable method for evaluating supplier bids based on balancing sustainability with cost and other factors using different weights. Now, there are several evaluation criteria that you can include besides this one in this example. For instance, do they measure emissions? What scope? What percentage of their fleet is alternatively fueled? If the supplier has a code of conduct, among other things. Remember, in this example, we're only analyzing one sustainability issue or risk. You must include all the other factors related to the remaining risks previously identified in the bid evaluation criteria when planning the contract that can be managed through the bid evaluation process. This is also true for all the other stages. Now, continue with the example of the CO2 reduction. We have contract management. You can ask the supplier to provide any equipment, then work with them during the contract to reduce CO2 impacts by setting targets and monitoring CO2 reduction. Now, in general, the most demanding positions are those taken in supplier selection and specification, as suppliers do not meet the requirement, cannot bid. Actions that support sustainability in bid evaluation give more options to the supplier to demonstrate innovation and allow buyers to evaluate various options, including their cost impacts. Actions in contract management are potentially the weakest actions, as they rely on the supplier to deliver them over time with continuous improvement. For risks that can be managed by option 5 as part of the contract management activity, a set of performance measures need to be determined. Now, here are some examples of different sustainability themes and performance measures. For instance, in energy use, you can measure the reduction in power consumption and the overall increase in the use of renewable energy. Now, one important point to discuss is that many of the sustainability impacts present in a contract will actually be further down the supply chain, with the suppliers, and so forth. This is beyond our Tier 1 suppliers. This has implications for contract management, as it will be necessary to ensure that your supplier is applying similar criteria to their suppliers down the supply chain. Now, how do you do this? By requiring suppliers to adopt a back-to-back contracts, using the precise terms and measures agreed with you at the same contract with their subcontractors and suppliers. This approach should ensure that sustainability commitments made in the contract are applied down the supply chain. It must, however, be recognized that back-to-back contracts are usually done for higher risk or value contracts, as they often are not popular with suppliers. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.7, Training and Capability Building. We already talked about the base steps from company assessment to supplier prioritization and the recurring steps from issue remediation to the procurement process. Now we're going to talk about the most advanced steps companies take in their sustainable procurement journey. Remediation and monitoring efforts have proven to be most successful in combination with efforts to build suppliers' management capabilities. Capability building includes a variety of efforts, from training for supplier personnel to worker hotlines and resource networks. This is a case study from HP. They invest in worker development and empower workers to improve social and environmental performance at their sites. Examples of capability building programs include the HER project, which provides basic personal health training to female workers. They've reached over 55,000 female migrant workers and empower them to take ownership of their health. Occupational health and safety OHS training to train suppliers on worker stress prevention, mental health awareness, and others. Training is the most important stage for supplier development. Some of the best practices are supplier assessment, an analysis of the supplier's operations and baseline data in order to have a realistic assessment of the current technical, business, and management capacity and identify the areas in which they need assistance. This is recommended mostly for the suppliers that you've identified have addressed issues of poor performance or non-compliance. The results from the assessment are used to identify common skill gaps and design a group training curriculum for all suppliers. These are some of the typical training categories: good business and management practices, finance, sustainability, and technical knowledge. Then you should develop an individual improvement program for each supplier within the capability building program. It's usually best to develop an individual improvement work plan for each supplier, where you detail all the categories and subcategory that it needs to build its capacity, the target it needs to achieve, and the associated deadlines. There are a variety of approaches that companies use to develop the skills and capacity of suppliers. Some of these are identified below. Public training, for instance, seminars to address common skill gaps or information on general topics. Formal training, mentoring and coaching, which is based on a unique training need identified in a supplier. Peer-to-peer training, where suppliers learn from each other, and experiential learning, where it means that people are learning through experience. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.8, Supplier Collaboration. Collaboration with suppliers goes beyond issue remediation and capability building. At this maturity, the suppliers are engaged to find areas of innovation. Working side by side with your suppliers, exchanging ideas, and progressing towards your goals together can prove extremely valuable. This is a case study from Timberland. They changed the way they work with suppliers from a compliance-based approach to a more collaborative approach focused on workers. Instead of leaving a list of violations and then coming back to verify improvements, the company now works more closely with factory management and their workers to understand the root cause of the issues, putting the workers at the center of the process. Supplier collaboration provides a valuable two-way street of assessment and feedback. But it's safe to assume that not all suppliers will have the tools at their immediate disposal to start implementing all the necessary changes to meet your sustainability standards. This is why collaboration is an advanced step, and we place it after monitoring performance, issue remediation, training, and capability building. Welcome to Section 2, Chapter 2.9, Stakeholder Partnerships. Industry collaboration and multi-stakeholder partnerships are important tools for advancing the company's supply chain sustainability objectives, particularly for issues that are too challenging and complex to tackle alone. Also, collaborative efforts represent a way for smaller companies with fewer resources to take actions and contribute to further supply chain sustainability. Now, two primary types of industry collaboration have merged. Best practice sharing, which can be focused in one industry or across sectors, for sharing knowledge about approaches and tools that companies have found to be successful in their individual supply chain sustainability programs. And there's joint standards. These collaborations are typically focused within one sector and they aim to create consistency among companies' expectations and programs. For instance, to create a shared code of conduct in one industry to make it easier for the suppliers. Companies not only collaborate with industry peers, but many companies also are starting to recognize the value of working with a broader range of stakeholders, including national and local governments, NGOs, activist organizations, academic experts, community groups, and others. Industry collaboration can create significant benefits for suppliers and companies, but it also comes with some risks. Here are some of them. The opportunities can be to gain leverage with suppliers, to increase credibility with stakeholders, and resource sharing. The risks are lack of internal buy-in, resource draining, the possibility that internal or external partners will be unwilling to change approaches to get alignment, and antitrust due to sensitive topics. Here's a case study of a very important multi-stakeholder partnership. In 2013, a factory collapsed in Bangladesh, killing more than 1,000 people. Before that, there were numerous of other fatal factory fires and accidents in that country. So, in 2017, leading fashion brands like H&M, Carrefour, American Eagle, and several others joined with unions and they signed a new Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety. The accord helps factories in Bangladesh become safe and stay safe for millions of workers. Currently, the accord covers more than 190 brands, 1,600 factories, and more than 2 million workers. They do factory inspections, monitoring remediation, safety training, resolving safety complaints. Here is a partial list of other industry collaboration examples. Most of them are industry specific, like the pharmaceutical supply chain initiative and the rail response. In the same concept of stakeholder collaboration, there are a number of data sharing platforms that can help collect and manage supplier information about sustainability performance. These include EcoVadis for CSR ratings of suppliers, Fair Factories Clearinghouse for factory audit and compliance data, and SEDEX for sharing ethical supply chain data. And with this, we conclude the 9-step sustainable procurement approach. Welcome to Section 3, Additional Benefits. Apart from the known positive impacts on the environment, people, and economy that we mentioned at the beginning of the course, here are some of the benefits of responsible procurement for companies. Meet existing and emerging legal and reporting requirements, reduce the cost of compliance, with a better approach to supply chain related regulatory requirements. Minimize business disruption from environmental, social, and economic impacts. For instance, with better risk management of diminishing availability of materials, quality, and price fluctuations of core commodities. Promote or ensure sustainability into end-to-end supplier relationship management, SRM. Protect the company's reputation and brand value. Meet customers, investors, and stakeholders' expectations. Reduce the use and cost of material inputs, energy, and transportation. Minimize harmful substances, which also carry a lower regulatory compliance burden. Increase the use of renewable and recyclable materials. Now, companies should become value and revenue driven rather than only cost driven. When adopting these practices, procurement will change in nature from a traditional cost driven activity to a value and revenue driven activity that is much better aligned with business management. Welcome to Section 4, Sustainability Impact KPIs. Some of the key performance indicators companies can use to measure their sustainability impact related to procurement and sourcing practices are percentage of spend that is sourced sustainably. The objective is to measure the percentage of spend sourced incorporating sustainability criteria in the supplier selection, specification, bid evaluation, and/or contract management. Percentage of diverse supplier spend. Diverse can be any definition a company might have. Small and medium-sized enterprises or SMEs, suppliers located in a specific territory, minority-owned, women-owned businesses, etc. Percentage of sustainable suppliers. To measure the number of suppliers that work according to the sustainability guidelines. The green arrow going up means as performance improves, the indicator score will increase. The green arrow going down means as performance improves, the indicator score will decrease. Percentage supplier tier visibility. The objective is to understand supplier practices and performance beyond Tier 1 suppliers. Percentage of employees trained in sustainable procurement. Percentage of suppliers trained in sustainability. Non-renewables materials intensity. The objective is to measure the use of materials with infinite supply as proportion of production. Restricted substances intensity. The objective to measure the use of substances restricted by law as a proportion of your production. Recycled or reused materials. The objective is to measure the use of recycled and reused materials as a proportion of overall materials used. Now, in order to calculate these indicators, you'll need to know the proportions of non-renewable materials and restricted substances and the volumes of recycled or reused materials used in your processes and for making your products. Your supplier should be able to provide you with most of this information. You'll need to record the weight of each material input, both raw materials and intermediate products, as well as the total weight of all material inputs. The first two indicators use a normalization factor. This is to present them in relative terms as a ratio of performance per specific unit of output. For instance, you can use the total weight of units produced in the facility as a normalization factor. Normalization is used to understand performance in a particular context.